laws and regulations, or is it in dynamic alignment where it is taking rules and regulations from the Commission over which we would have no vote? And they may huff and puff. What that suggests, Mr. Speaker, is actually they want this Parliament to continue to take rules from the Commission, but in the future to have no say over those rules. So we do want a situation where you have two sovereign states, but it's not on the basis of deregulation, it's about sovereignty.
Right in trusting that we have a cunning plan to leave on the 31st of October.
My radical friend tempts me with his knowledge of the relevant box sets into dangerous territory, I fear. The Prime Minister does have clarity in what he is seeking in these negotiations. The framework of that was set out in the letter to President Tusk, where we narrowed down the negotiating objects to the backstop in the withdrawal agreement and to a best-in-class free trade agreement in the political declaration. That is the plan. It is very clear.
Order. In calling the honourable member for Brecon and Radnorshire, I should like again to congratulate her warmly on her splendid maiden speech yesterday afternoon. Jane Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Diolch yn fawr iawn. I would like to ask the Minister what he would say to the National Farmers Union, who say that a no-deal Brexit would be catastrophic for farmers. The Farmers Union of Wales say it would have disastrous consequences for farmers. Could I ask the Minister what he would say, sitting opposite family farms in places like Brecon and Radnorshire and across Wales, who really fear for the livelihoods of their futures? Thank you.
Thank you, and may I join you, Mr. Speaker, in welcoming the Honourable Lady and also paying tribute to her maiden speech yesterday, where I thought she spoke with great distinction. The specific issues pertaining particularly to the sheep industry were addressed at much greater length than perhaps the Chair will give me now in the adjournment debate that the Minister of State. So firstly, I would refer the Honourable Lady to the comments and the issues that the Minister of State. Well, I mean, I can go into it. I mean, he talked about, I watched the adjournment, so he talked about the misunderstanding that one of the members opposite had on the impact of depreciation on experts. We can talk about the measures they're putting in place in terms of headage, the support for the industry there. We talk about the level of exports. We can get into the details, John and ladies. It's just the Chair, I'm sure, will want me to be fairly succinct, and the adjournment covered it in more length.
Anna Turley.
Question 5, please, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the UK leaves the EU without a deal, the UK would implement a temporary tariff regime. This would apply for up to 12 months while a full consultation takes place and a review on a permanent approach is undertaken.
Anna Turley.
Much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the Minister's response and the letter I received from the Department for International Trade this morning. But from the meetings that we had with the Department, we're told that biofuels will not be covered by these protection tariffs. Entities in my constituency tell me that the fear of a no-deal Brexit is already harming business. We know a no-deal Brexit without tariff protection will kill British biofuels, end jobs and leave us reliant on imports. Will he commit to working with his colleagues to maintain tariff protection on ethanol before it's too late?
Actually, the Honourable Lady raises a very legitimate issue and she raises it in a very constructive way, and I'm very happy to work with her because she is championing on behalf of the constituents a very genuine issue. There's always a balance in these things in setting tariffs between what is protecting consumers and what are the issues for producers and how we calibrate those two sometimes competing issues. She'll understand within the markets there's also within the industry domestic pressure regardless of Brexit that is there, but I'm very happy to work with her on that issue.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will be aware from Yellowhammer that the proposed tariff regime under a no-deal creates very specific risks for the UK oil refining sector. Given that the Valero refinery at Pembroke is the largest and most important private sector employer in West Wales, could the Minister tell me what is the plan for protecting the UK refining sector if we do end up leaving the EU without a deal?
So my right honourable friend will know that there have been concerns raised by the industry inspector that pertaining to the answer I gave a moment ago, there are also pressures existing within that market that are also a factor. I'm very happy, as I say to the honourable lady, to have further discussions with him because there's a number of issues that come into play around that industry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a group of medicines that simply cannot be stockpiled and rely upon an uninterrupted supply of imports. Can the Secretary of State give a 100% guarantee that none of my constituents will suffer a shortage of that type of medicines as a result of a no-deal Brexit?
Well, as I set out at the opening of department questions, not only have we put in place additional procurement framework in terms of capacity, but we have also procured an express freight service to deliver small consignments on a 24-hour basis and a 2 to 4 day pallet delivery service. So these issues are being addressed by the department and a huge amount of work is going on exactly that issue.
Andrew Lewer.
Number 6, Mr. Speaker.
D. Minister Doddridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since joining the department on the 27th of July, I've personally met over 20 business organisations, and since July 2016, the Department for Exiting the European Union ministers have collectively undertaken over 700 meetings with businesses and business organisations from every sector in the economy.
Andrew Lewer.
Northamptonshire is one of the most important logistics hubs in the UK, so what steps is the department taking to make sure that those firms and businesses are up and ready to deal with a possible no-deal Brexit?
That's a very sensible question. The department has engaged extensively with logistics companies and representative bodies from across the sector to ensure they're prepared for the 31st of October. And I would encourage the honourable member and businesses to consult the public information campaign gov.uk to get practical step-by-step guide on what is required for business. That is a powerful thing to do. That's the right thing to do in preparing to leave properly on the 31st of October.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. What information can the Minister give us about what preparation has been done, what proactive contact his department has made with those businesses who may not directly trade with Europe but whose supply chains or customers do and who may not therefore have availed themselves of the government pages?
Good question.
Minister.
I would certainly specifically encourage those businesses to avail themselves of that opportunity. The department sent out 1,300 bits of information that's captured on the gov.uk website. I've engaged with businesses, in particular I'm the SME champion for the department, but the one thing that I have noticed, and I would share with honourable members, is larger businesses do tend to be more prepared than smaller businesses, particularly the type of which she speaks, and the departmental website is, or sorry, the government website is a rich source of information, so I would encourage members to return the their constituency and alongside campaigning promote the government website.
Gregory Campbell.
Mr. Speaker, there's a massive differentiation between some of the realistic concerns that businesses have about a no deal and some of the madcap scare stories that are going around. What is the Minister doing to ensure there is an understanding of realistic concerns and dismissing some of those other wild stories?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There will always be knockabout politics. I would prefer to engage in the detail. I was in Northern Ireland last Thursday talking to businesses on the border and then in Belfast discussing around alternative arrangements, discussing them with a wide range of business, engaging in the very real detail and not the high-level scare stories. There are concerns, they're being dealt with, but they shouldn't be confused with the bigger scare stories.
Number 7.
You stay.
I've had extensive discussions, Mr. Speaker, over the summer recess with European counterparts. I suspect the right honourable gentleman and I have seen a little less of summer than some. In the last fortnight, that's included in Paris, Copenhagen, Helsinki, and a couple of other places. So there's been extensive engagement, and that engagement continues.
Mr. Philip Dunn.
I'm very encouraged to hear my right honourable friend begin to list some of his summer itinerary. I think it would help build confidence that the government is engaged in serious discussions with the EU Commission and other counterparts. And to that effect, would he be prepared to publish whom he has met, the discussions that he's had when not in meetings, with whom and when?
I would just say that I'm sure that the unknown place to which the right honourable gentleman has referred has not forgotten that the Secretary of State visited it and its inhabitants. Secretary of State.
I fear I may get in trouble for the said unknown place, but I hope a bit of latitude will be granted. My right honourable friend raises actually a very material point, because it goes to the crux of the debate last night as to the sincerity of the negotiations. And there's also been extensive contact by the Prime Minister through the G7, through his visits to Berlin and Paris, amongst others, through the extensive work to which I pay huge tribute of the European advisor to the Prime Minister, who has been in Brussels this week, and again has travelled extensively. So significant work has been going on, and very happy to look at what further detail we can set out.
Jenny Chapman.
Well, if all that's true, why did Dominic Cummings call the negotiations a sham?
So, well, firstly, as she well knows, the government don't comment on leaks, but secondly, the issue really is looking at the substance. Look at the letter from President Tusk to President Tusk that narrows the issues down. Now, it would have been much easier for the Prime Minister to set out a long list of demands. But because of the seriousness of the negotiation, those have been narrowed down as set out in that letter. One of the charges from the European Union to the previous government, I apologise to the Honourable Lady, one of the charges at the previous government was it hadn't been specific enough as to what sort of future relationship was sought in the political declaration. It's answered that question very clearly with a best-in-class FTA, and that doesn't just cover the economic side, that's also looking at the security side and other aspects. So the point is, there is substance there. The problem on the other side is they don't want to leave at all, and therefore they won't take yes for an answer.
Adrian Bailey.
Number 8, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'll group questions 8 and 12 together. I spoke to the Home Secretary this week on matters relating to security and to the Policing Minister as well, relating to us exiting the European Union. The Department has exiting European Union ministers and officials that hold regular meetings with the Home Office, and we're working closely to prepare for business, keeping our plans under rigorous review, and I will continue to do so.
Bailey.
Under a no-deal Brexit, UK police would lose access to 40 enforcement tools, including the European arrest warrant and access to European information databases vital for identifying international terrorists and criminals that could be targeting this country. Can he explain how that is assisting us to take back control of our borders?
Well, one thing that would certainly assist is 20,000 extra police officers. I challenge the Honourable Member. But getting down to the specifics, I did want to make a political point. You'll forgive me for making a political point, given we're into an election, or certainly we think we're into an election. But on the specific details, so Interpol notices function very similar to SIS. To the Honourable Gentleman reasonably talks of the European arrest warrant. In the event that we leave without a deal, the UK will operate the Council for European Convention on Extradition with EU member states, and we've worked intensively with operational partners both here and across the EU to ensure that there's a smooth transition between the two.
Jack Dromey.
Mr. Speaker, Operation Yellowhammer found, and I quote, that a no-deal Brexit could lead to a rise in public disorder and community relations. Does the government not recognise that the toxic and irresponsible use of language like collaborators, treachery, surrender, deepens the divisions in our country, puts the public at risk, including members of this House? Have the government not learnt the tragic lessons of history?
Minister.
Can I gently say to the Honourable Gentleman, one thing that will lead to unrest and unhappiness is the public and the referendum result being ignored. But we continue to work with the police and army in the normal way.
Mr. Bob Neal.
Number 9, sir.
Minister Dudridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start by thanking my honourable friend, who I don't seem to see in the chamber. He is. I apologise, Mr. Speaker. It was in no way an insult to his height or presence. I was going to congratulate someone on his work on the Justice Select Committee. The government is committed to maintaining over time, growing the United Kingdom's £4.4 billion trade service in legal services, and this includes setting the right framework under future trade negotiations.
Mr. Robert Neal.
There's always more than one way to be overlooked. Does the Minister accept that at the moment the United Kingdom has the second largest market in legal services in the world and the largest in the European Union? That is itself because of the unparalleled access which British lawyers currently have into EU legal markets under the appropriate directives. Does the Minister recognise that if we are to avoid the 10% hit that the Law Society estimates would occur in the event of a no-deal Brexit to the income to this country of British legal services, it is important that we preserve the maximum access to those markets, but also have a comprehensive strategy across all departments to market British legal services as a world centre of excellence elsewhere?
I fully agree with the honourable gentleman. 6.5% of global legal services pass through the United Kingdom. 3 out of 15 top firms are based internationally in the UK. It's essential we work on a cross-departmental basis, and the Legal Services Great Campaign is a good example of this ambitious programme. And since its launch in Singapore in October 2017, it's campaigned in over 30 countries with transmissions to Kazakhstan, China, Chile and Nigeria. These will continue and they are very effective.
Ellie Reeves.
Question number 10.
Minister Doddridge.
The European Union has confirmed that it will grant UK nationals visa-free travel to the Schengen area for short stays of up to 90 days in any 180-day period, even in a no-deal scenario. In the event of no deal, UK nationals, when travelling to the European Union, that will change, and we've published advice on gov.uk on the steps that UK nationals will need to take.
Ellie Reeves.
Many EU nationals in Lewisham, West and Penge have endured incredible stress and anxiety over the uncertainty that they've faced since the referendum. Their rights have been used as a bargaining chip with the EU, and the new Home Secretary even proposed legislation to stop freedom of movement immediately after no deal. So will the Minister today give us his assurances that citizens' rights will no longer be used as a negotiating tool and will be unilaterally guaranteed?
Well, citizens' rights will not be used as a negotiating tool. They have not been used as a negotiating tool, and the honourable member mischaracterises the position. It is the Prime Minister that has made a big, bold offer to EU citizens. It's now for member states to reciprocate.
Oh, very well. Ruth George.
Thank you. What assessment has the government made of the impact on people with pre-existing health conditions who no longer can use the European health insurance cards to cover their conditions if they either now live in the EU or are travelling?
Minister.
Well, this will depend on decisions and arrangements with individual companies, and I would encourage them to reciprocate the big, bold offer that the UK have made to EU nationals in the United Kingdom.
Paul Blomfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I welcome the Minister to his place. He will know that over the summer recess, a Home Office advert on settled status was banned for being misleading. Now, the uncertainty created by these conflicting messages is causing real fear among EU citizens in the UK and the British in Europe. So I wrote to the Secretary of State on the 21st of August seeking clarity on 5 key issues. I've not had a reply, so I wonder if the Minister can answer one of them, and I'm reassured by the way he indicated that he likes to engage in detail. EU citizens were promised that if the UK leaves the EU without a deal, their rights will be the same as under the withdrawal agreement. So can the Minister confirm that despite previous indications to the contrary, the government will retain the right to appeal settled status decisions in the case of a no-deal Brexit?
Minister.
Well, the settled status scheme is working very well. Over 1 million people out of the 3 million have applied. Nobody has been rejected, and people have the ability to apply all the way up to the 31st of December 2020.
Newlands.
Number 11, Mr. Speaker.
The government is delivering over 300 specific no-deal projects across a range of sectors, and delivery is well advanced. There is still more work to do, and we are turbocharging our preparation under the leadership of the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster.
Gavin Newland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard so much nonsense this morning, in fact, over the last 3 years, that it wasn't really a surprise this morning to hear the Secretary of State talk about a depreciation of experts in the government. But last night, this House voted for legislation to block a no-deal Brexit. So does he accept the vote of this House, and will his government strictly adhere to the rule of law when this bill has royal assent?
A little dismissive of the benches opposite for the honourable gentleman to dismiss it as all as nonsense. I think it's the first SNP question, so saying we've already heard the nonsense seems a tad premature. The reality is the government is preparing extensively for no deal. We have a big information campaign which has launched. There's over 300 projects underway, and we are working actually constructively with the devolved administrations, including the Scottish Government.
Mr. Peter-Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the bill that passed this House yesterday becomes an Act of Parliament, that governs what we do in this country. But of course we cannot guarantee a no deal because the European Union might not agree to an extension. So would the Secretary of State agree or confirm that the government will continue to prepare for no deal despite any Act of Parliament here, because it's not within our control what happens?
My honourable friend is a keen observer of these matters, and he is absolutely correct. So the decision on an extension is not a... The honourable lady says what? I'm merely stating the legal position. I'm sorry that she finds the legal position somewhat distasteful, but that is the legal position. The legal position on an extension is that it requires the support of every member state, including the United Kingdom. So it is the case. The honourable gentleman, my honourable friend, is correct. She keeps chuntering. My honourable friend is correct in his question, which is we would need to continue to prepare for no deal because it is within the scope of any member of state to block an extension. That is the legal position.
Grady. Speaker, the Scottish Parliament tonight will vote overwhelmingly, I'm sure, to oppose this government's intention to crash out with a no deal and to condemn its decision to prorogue Parliament for 5 solid weeks. It's the case that nobody in Scotland voted for no deal. Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union. So will the government pay attention to the views of Scotland, or does it simply not care?
Well, I think not just this government will pay attention. I'm sure the people of Scotland will pay attention to a vote against democracy. It's not the first time that the benches opposite have ignored the votes of the British people, whether it's in the referendum in 2014 that they want to overturn, or the referendum of the United Kingdom in 2016. They seem to have a problem with listening to the democratic will of the people.
Vickers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At my discussions with ABP, who manage the Port of Immingham and the other Humber ports, there's a clear indication that they are well prepared in their contingency plans to handle any problems that may occur. Could the Secretary of State confirm that our ports are indeed well prepared for no deal, and also that they can take a much heart from the advantages such as free port status that will be available post-Brexit?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I met with the Association of British Ports and others before the reshuffle looking at these issues, and they are well advanced. He'll also know that the government's allocated additional funding for those ports, and he'll also be aware that whilst in this place a huge amount of the debate tends to focus on Dover because of the vehicle flow through Dover, in terms of the actual containers and value of goods going through, it is the other ports that are actually more significant in terms of their value.
Mr. Speaker, the Yellowhammer report that the government are determined to hide from us warns of delays of up to 2.5 days at ports, freight traffic capacity reduced by 40 to 60%, and in terms medical supplies vulnerable to severe extended delays. The government tried to pretend that was an old report, but that wasn't true. It's August 2019. They tried to pretend it was a very, very worst-case scenario. That's not true either. It's a reasonable worst-case scenario, not the most likely, but likely enough to need to be planned for. When will the government accept that all the trade organisations, all the professional bodies, all the people who understand the industry who are saying that no deal would be a disaster are right, and that this government is the ones that are wrong?
Well, there's an oddity, Mr. Speaker, within the honourable gentleman's question, because he accuses us of hiding the Yellowhammer documentation, and yet it's shared with the Scottish Government as part of our internal working to prepare for no deal. So we're not hiding these, but it is the case in government that you prepare documents prepare documents on which you then put in place funding and other measures to tackle them. And in fact, the Public Accounts Committees and others were the first to criticise if that detailed preparation was not taking place.
Mr. Peter Grant.
Is the government today giving absolutely unreserved and unrestricted permission to the governments of Scotland and Wales to publish that report in full today? Yes or no?
No, it's always the case that in government you prepare documents in order to work and ensure we have the preparation in place. The point is, what is likely? What is the impacts on the EU27? What is it we can put in place that addresses the concerns such as on the flow of goods? I alluded in my earlier question, for example, on the 2/3 of medicines that go to Ireland. I could have said about the 40% of Irish exports. 40% of Irish exports go through Dover. This is an issue that concerns both the Commission and the United Kingdom. That's why we're preparing these documents. We're working openly with the Scottish Government and others on that, and that is what the Government should be doing.
Finally, Mr. Alan Brown.
Question 14, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Doddridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I spoke with the Home Secretary this week on the issues of the EU settlement scheme. The scheme is operating well. 1 million people have passed through that scheme out of the 3 million. There have been no rejected applications, and the Prime Minister made a very big, bold offer to EU citizens who remain our friends, our neighbours, and they're welcome here in the United Kingdom.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister says the system's working well. I can tell him the reality is it is not. My wife Cindy is an EU citizen, and due to the government rhetoric, she reluctantly decided to apply for settled status. I can tell the Government Minister the system crashed, and the officials operating it said that they couldn't handle the volume of traffic. Is it because of this process is a shambles that the government's had to do a U-turn in the 31st October threat of ending freedom of movement, or is it the threat of court actions that's caused the U-turn?
Minister.
We have improved the system on an ongoing basis and are keen to do so. And the default position is that we want people to get that settled status. The honourable gentleman makes some specific points around a specific case, and I'm sure the Home Office would be happy to look at that and understand how they can improve the system further.
Order. Topical questions. Louise Haigh.
Topical number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, since I last updated the House, I have pleasure in welcoming my honourable friend, the member for Watford and Southend, to his ministerial place, and an opportunity to thank my honourable friends, the member for Spelthorne and Braintree, who now both join me in the Cabinet. We have a new Prime Minister who is committed to leaving on the 31st of October, and within the ministerial portfolios, I welcome my right honourable friend, the Chancellor Duchy of Lancaster, who has taken on responsibility for domestic operational planning in the context of no deal. This, Mr. Speaker, enables me and my department to focus on negotiations with the EU, in which we will seek to achieve a best-in-class free trade agreement. Throughout the summer, I have visited a number of European capitals and had regular conversations with my key interlocutors, including the Deputy Prime Minister of Ireland and the French Europe Minister, with whom I had recent productive meetings in Paris.
Mr. Speaker, if I was still a serving police officer and I had arrested a European national who, unbeknownst to me, was wanted for a string of serious violent sexual offences, at the moment I would simply have to access a database on booking him into custody in order to find that out. Could the Secretary of State spell out in detail how I or my custody sergeant would do that if we leave without a deal on the 1st of November?
So, well, under the current position, it would depend which member state it pertained to, because we've already got in place a bilateral arrangement with Ireland to reflect the common travel area, so it would depend within the member states, because the arrangements currently are in place, vary between those member states. But she's right in the premise of her question, which is we stand willing, because the UK puts more data on the European arrest warrant than any other member state. We think that the UK contribution is of value to the European Union, and that it's not in their interest to put their citizens at risk by not reciprocating that. So we stand ready to work with them. It is the Commission and my counterpart Michel Barnier who has ruled out what he calls mini deals to address the concern that she raises.
Trudy Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend confirm that when we leave the EU, with or without a deal, the provision of medicines will remain uninterrupted into the UK?
As we covered earlier in the question session, a huge amount of work has been done by the Department of Health and Social Care, including additional procurement capacity, including their express delivery, and that builds on extensive work by the industry, both in terms of additional stock and in terms of the additional flow capacity they themselves have procured.
Mr. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to ask specifically about the important issue of Northern Ireland. Can the Secretary of State confirm that the government remains fully committed to all the existing elements of the December 2017 joint report between the UK and the EU negotiators? Yes or no?
So our commitments have been set out in the letter to President Tusk, and what that says within that is our commitment to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, which includes putting no infrastructure at the border to impede north-south flow.
Mr. Speaker, I asked a careful question. I got a careful answer, and it wasn't to confirm full commitment. So let me press on, because it's been reported this week that the EU member states were told by the Commission that the UK government was proposing to reduce the ambitions of the 2017 joint report relating to Northern Ireland. So not the Good Friday Agreement, the 2017 joint report. In particular, it's reported that the UK is rowing back from the legally operable solutions, the words in the report, to avoiding a hard border, to what has been described as aspirational measures, quite specific. And a pledge only now to have trade across the Irish border that is as frictionless as possible. Again, a difference. These are very important issues, and I know there's been a bit of knockabout this morning, but this is of huge importance across Ireland. Can the Secretary of State take this opportunity to reject these reports and make clear that there will be no rowing back from the solemn commitments made 2 years ago in that 2017 joint report?
Secretary of State.
Well, as I said in my previous answer, first, there's no rowing back from the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. That's an area of common accord between us. Secondly, the reason I pointed towards the North-South cooperation is he will be well aware that in the letter to President Tusk, the Prime Minister drew a distinction between the backstop and the Northern Ireland Protocol, and he will know that whilst in this chamber they're often used interchangeably, there is a distinction between those two things, particularly on the basis that the North-South cooperation, the common travel area and the benefits of the single electricity market are distinct from the points in terms of alignment. So there was a distinction drawn there. In terms of his further question around legally operative text, to some extent, I addressed this point in part in my remarks in the chamber yesterday, in that there is a distinction between the Commission saying that all aspects need to be set out in legally operative text by the 31st of October, and looking at, for example, what role the Joint Commission has during the implementation period, because the implementation period often means that things need to be in place by the end of December 2020, or if extended for 1 or 2 further years by mutual agreement. So it is within that there is a distinction to be drawn.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Secretary of State think there should be a general election before the next European Council so the British people can decide whether they want the leader of the opposition as Prime Minister and keep us in the European Union, or whether the British people want to return our excellent current Prime Minister and take us out by the 31st of October?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, yes, we need to know at the 17th of October Council who can negotiate on the British people, and in particular who can deliver on the express will that's set out in the referendum. And what we have from the benches opposite is a doublespeak that will leave us in legislative purgatory, because they're saying on the one hand that they will vote against every deal that is put forward. 3 times they voted against the deal. Their own deal was rejected by the House as well, and yet they also vote against no deal. Well, the inevitable consequence of that is that they're not prepared to leave, even though their own manifesto said they will. And the real question for the British public at the next election will be how can you trust what Labour say in their manifesto on Brexit when they have gone back on every word of what they said at the last general election?
Say something about that. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to the question from my honourable friend, we are now halfway through the time period set by the German Chancellor to produce the alternatives to the backstop. In the light that governments have decided to prorogue Parliament from perhaps next Monday, will the Secretary of State ensure that their proposals come to this House so that they can be scrutinised by this House, and including the Select Committee for leaving the European Union?
I think the chair of the Select Committee will concede that I have probably been the most frequent of the holders, I know there's been more than one, holders of this role in terms of the regularity of my appearances before his committee and others. In terms of the well, actually, not compared to the first one, actually, but compared to the second, the Foreign Secretary. In terms of the substance of the question, a huge amount of work has gone on. For example, it goes to the member for Ludlow's question. I think of the alternative working groups. I chair the technical working group. My honourable friend, the member for Rochford and South Wales East, chairs the business group. He was in Northern Ireland with that group over the summer. And I think it goes again to the question to the member for Ludlow. Work has been going on throughout the summer on alternative arrangements. But if it's simply published against an all-weather, all-insurance test, it will be dismissed, as it was under the last government, as magical thinking. That's what the last government experienced. So we need to get into that detail. That work is going on, but it needs to be discussed in the appropriate way.
Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could my right honourable friend confirm whether or not, since July the 25th, the Department has had any discussions with the financial sector about the implications of any revised policy, which would be a policy of regulatory divergence?
He raises a specific issue, and as a former Economic Secretary to the Treasury, and knowing that the markets take a keen interest in these sort of discussions, if I may, I'll ask the Chancellor or the Economic Secretary to come back to him on this specific issue that he raises.
Dr. Rosanna Allen Carr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thousands of Tooting residents have signed my local petition against this government's dangerous Brexit plans. Like me, Tooting wants to remain. The Brexit Secretary voted against legislation to block a disastrous no deal. Tooting are absolutely furious. Why is he trying to drive this country blindly off the Brexit cliff?
Secretary of State.
I think the Honourable Lady would agree with me that there's more than one voice in Tooting, and I'm sure there will be a range of voices, as indeed there are, but I don't reconcile from the fact that I'm sure she speaks for a majority in her constituency in making that point. The point that I think is behind my approach is when this Parliament says that it will give the British people the say, when the government of the day writes to the British people and says it will honour the result. When this House then votes to trigger Article 50 by a significant margin to deliver on that result, it undermines our democracy. If we then have members of this House on the one hand voting against a deal, and then the other hand saying that we'll countenance no deal. I think that's a threat to our democracy, and I think it's a threat to our international reputation as a country that defends democracy around the world.
Neil O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What steps is my right honourable friend taking to protect farmers and manufacturers in the hopefully unlikely event of a no-deal Brexit?
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question. It is a very important question. DEFRA have confirmed that they will support the same farmers in the same cash terms as they've been supported under the current scheme, and we're looking with farmers to look at new markets across government, working with them on business. We continue to work with businesses both large and small, and would particularly encourage small businesses to engage with the government in their preparation in the eventuality of no deal.
Martin Doherty Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I congratulate the Secretary of State on his grand tour of Europe in the recent weeks during the recess, notably to Finland, a nation of 5 million people, an enthusiastic member of the European Union. Can I ask him specifically, given that the UK was actually only the 7th largest importer to Finland in 2018, How will leave the single market and the customs union improve on that dismal position?
Well, first, on the one hand, colleagues question whether we're engaging, and then on the other hand, the honourable gentleman sort of appears to suggest that we're engaging too much, and therefore he needs to make his mind up. In terms of how we promote further trade, firstly, there are opportunities beyond Europe that we're keen to seize, and the Secretary of State for International Trade. On the issue that he chances on Finland, well, actually, Mr. Speaker, I chaired a breakfast meeting with business leaders when I was in Helsinki, including looking, for example, the links on key areas like timber, where there is an appetite to further strengthen bilateral trade. And there was a huge appetite within the business leaders I spoke to there to do more trade with the United Kingdom, including with Scotland as part of that United Kingdom.
Order. Urgent question, Mr. David Liddington.
Speaker, sir, with permission, I should like to ask the Secretary of State for Transport if he will make a statement on the government's review of HS2.
Thank you, sir. The Secretary of State for Transport, Secretary Grant Shapps.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my first time at the dispatch box as the new Secretary of State for Transport, and I welcome the opportunity to update the House on HS2. I don't think there's any future in obscuring the cost benefits or timetable of HS2, so I've announced on the 21st of August an independent cross-party review led by Douglas Oakervie into whether and how HS2 should or shouldn't proceed. The review will consider its affordability, its deliverability, benefits, scope, phasing, including its relationship with Northern Powerhouse Rail. The chair will be supported by a deputy chair, Lord Barclay, and a panel of experts from business, academia and transport to ensure it's independent, thorough and objective in its assessment programme. Some of these individuals on the panels have been very passionate advocates, others have been extremely vocal critics of this project, but these panellists will provide input to and be consulted on the report's conclusions. This review is actually underway and it will report to me on time this autumn. I'll discuss its findings with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, and its recommendations will help inform our decisions on the next step or otherwise for this project. On our first day back on the 3rd of September, colleagues will be aware that I placed in the House, or if they're not, it's there, advice that I received over the summer from the recently appointed chairman of HS2 Limited, Alan Cook, on the cost and deliverability of the current scheme. The chairman of HS2 has said that he does not believe the current scheme can be delivered within the budget of £55.7 billion set in 2015 prices. Instead, he estimates that the current scheme requires a total budget, including contingency, in the range of 72 to 78 billion, again set in 2015 prices. And regarding schedule, the chairman does not believe the current schedule of 2026 will be delivered for its initial services of phase 1. He doesn't think that's realistic. In line with lessons from other large major transport infrastructure projects, his advice proposes a range of start dates rather than a specific one. He recommends 2028 to 2031 for phase 1, with the staged opening starting with initial services between London Old Oak Common, Birmingham Curzon Street, followed by services to and from London Euston later. He expects phase 2B, the full high-speed line to Manchester and Leeds, to be open between 2035 and 2040. The chairman is also of the view that the benefits of the current scheme are also substantially undervalued. All these matters will now be considered by Douglas Oakervie within the scope of the Oakervie review itself. I said when I announced the independent review into HS2 that I now want Doug Oakervie and his panel to assess independently these findings and other available existing evidence. That review will provide recommendations on whether and how we proceed. Stepping back, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make one further wider point. We all in this House know we must invest in modern infrastructure to ensure the future prosperity of our nation. However, it is right that we subject every single project to the most rigorous scrutiny possible. And if we are to truly maximise every opportunity, this must always be done with an open mind and a clean sheet of paper.
Mr. David Liddington.
Mr. Speaker, can I first of all congratulate my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, on his new responsibilities and welcome the review that the government has set up. I have three questions for my right honourable friend. First, in view of this week's revelation that HS2 is overrunning both its budget and its schedule, something which many of us have been predicting for a long time but which has been systematically denied for years by HS2 Limited and by his department, what assurance can my right honourable friend give to the House about the transparency of both the review that has been commissioned and the government's formal response to that? Second, my right honourable friend will know that enabling works for HS2 are still being carried out along phase 1 of the route. Ancient woodlands are being felled, productive farmland is being occupied and used by HS2 Limited. Public money is being spent on these works, while the review, as my right honourable friend says, may lead to a recommendation to cancel or significantly change the project altogether. So will the Secretary of State now accept that those works are prejudicial to the outcome of the review that he has established and order that they cease? Third, I have a queue of constituents whose land has been taken by HS2 Limited for preparatory works, but who have still to receive the payments that were formally agreed with HS2 Limited. Now, the government is rightly committed to crack down on late payment. Would my right honourable friend not agree that HS2 Limited should be setting an example in this regard, acting as a laggard? And since he, as Secretary of State, is the sole shareholder in HS2 Limited, will he now take responsibility for insisting that HS2 Limited puts this injustice right immediately?
Hey.
I completely agree. There is no future in trying to obscure costs or being unclear about it. It is the case that in a massive infrastructure project, Europe's biggest, in a developing project, costs just aren't known, they're speculated about, you then start to firm them up as you literally dig into the ground in this case. So I can see how over a period of time things move, but nonetheless, I simply take the view, as soon as I got the information, I will inform the House. As soon as I got that Cook report and the House returned, I stuck it straight into the library. I can assure my right honourable friend I will continue to do exactly that going forward. Secondly, I think it might be helpful to colleagues to know that I've asked for Douglas Oakerby to meet with members of Parliament. He has set up in committee room on Monday 2A on Monday the 9th between 3:30 and 5 an opportunity for any colleagues to go and see him, and you can make your own arrangements with him separately, but I'll inform the House of that. On the enabling works, look, we're in a position where I'll have to make a go, no-go decision about this in December. And I know that this won't delight my right honourable friend, but it seemed to me that even to be in that position, if we didn't continue to make preparatory works, then I wouldn't be in a go, no-go decision. I'm sorry to disappoint him, but that is the current position, and then we can take a decision. On CPO payments, I share his concern and anxiety. When people are having their lives, their livelihoods, their homes potentially ripped apart by a project, supposedly for the wider good, it is right that the state compensates them promptly and efficiently. I would be most grateful to see more details of those cases. I've already had one across my desk, which I've sorted out, and I'd like to see others. There's no excuse for a CPO where people aren't paid for it.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too congratulate the Secretary of State on his appointment and welcome him to his place. And he comes into post at a time of crisis for the country, but an absolutely critical moment for HS2. I would just gently remind him that we did ask for regular reports and we recommended a peer review when Phase 2A was before this House some weeks ago, and I'm sorry that he wasn't able to vote for that, or indeed for the Prime Minister to express a view at all. He's also mentioned that this is a cross-party review underway. I just gently point out that there's been no consultation with me whatsoever, and if it's to be genuinely cross-party, perhaps he might want to take up that invitation. But we've been consistently told by his predecessors and his then ministerial team that the 2015 figure of £55.7 billion for the entire project was the full cost of HS2 and that there was no reason to change it. Mr. Speaker, it's hard to conclude anything other that it has been plain and obvious for some considerable time that this was not accurate. So I asked the Transport Secretary, when was his predecessor told that the figure of £55.7 billion was not accurate or sustainable, and when was he first told that the timetable for delivery could not be adhered to? Mr. Speaker, isn't this yet more evidence that this government has totally failed to exercise any control over this project, not just in terms of cost, but in terms of redundancy payments and key appointments, which transpired to be unsustainable? Not only that, Mr. Speaker, when the contracts for Phase 1 were being granted, despite hedge fund managers making a packet out of the inevitable demise of Carillion, this Tory government crashed on regardless, awarding the doomed organisation a valuable HS2 contract. Mr. Speaker, that the government has been totally incompetent and reckless is beyond doubt. But worse than that, there hangs over this government the unpleasant smell that Parliament may have been misled, however unwittingly, given that it's stark staringly obvious that when the Minister responsible for HS2 stood at that dispatch box a matter of weeks ago to tell the House that there was only one figure for HS2 and one figure alone, that assertion was completely and totally inaccurate. If there is going to be delay, can the Secretary of State give some assurance to the 9,000 people who are currently employed by HS2, what assurances can be given to them? Mr. Speaker, this government continues to be characterised by lack of transparency, and I welcome the remarks of the Secretary of State to put that right, but that still remains, and that lack of candour. And Mr. Speaker, once we can be assured that there is no prospect of them reneging on the legislation to avoid a no-deal Brexit, we on this side of the House relish the prospect of a general election to turf them out.
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Look, on regular reports, I will come back to this House as many times as the House is prepared to hear about it and continue to update in every possible way possible. I thought it might be helpful if I also were to make the introduction, if the Honourable Gentleman hasn't already, had it to Doug Oakervey and perhaps organise for him to meet separately with him. There are, of course, cross-party members on the review, and the review is genuinely kind of full of sceptics. I think people were surprised when we launched a review which had such a broad cross view on this project. Look, in terms of prices, I mean, he's absolutely right, the prices have changed over time. I seem to recall that this was originally a project by the previous Labour government. It was going to cost about £13 billion for the whole thing when it was first conceived. One of the issues that we have, and I think it's a wider issue than HS2, is that these things start off being fixed in a price of a particular period of time. This £55.7 billion was about 2015 prices, and it doesn't actually allow for inflation. And so you end up quoting prices which are just out of date, and every project on that basis will always be said to have overrun on costs. Of course, it probably actually the benefits also improve as well. So I think we have to find better ways of doing all of this. I can reassure the Honourable Gentleman, the first that I received advice on this was Alan Cook's final report on the 1st of August, and that's the report that I published. And finally, I can undertake that we will make sure that we return to this House with every piece of update that we have, and I encourage him to be involved in the Oakervey review.
Colleagues will be aware that there is some pressure on time today because there are several further pieces of business to follow, but equally understandably there is intense interest in this monumental mess. And I know that the Secretary of State is very keen, to his credit, to answer questions on the matter, so I shall do my best, as always, to accommodate the understandable interest of colleagues. Dame Cheryl Gillan.
Mr. Speaker, I was just about to say there are still people affected, members affected by this project that don't have a voice. I was going to include yourself. Clearly that is not the case. And of course, the Right Honourable Member for South Northamptonshire, who has always joined me in the fight against HS2. And in welcoming the Secretary of State to his position, can I also welcome my Right Honourable friend from my neighbouring friend in Aylesbury? It's so good to hear his voice raised in this chamber against this dreadful project. I endorse and everything that the member for Aylesbury has said, and it applies to my constituency as well. Can I say to the Secretary of State that he also needs to look at the National Rail Travel Survey, on which one of the raison d'etres for this project is based. It has not been updated since 2010. In answers to me, the department doesn't appear to know how much it would cost to update it. But that, coupled with the fact that we are not allowed still to see the passenger forecasting documentation, means that transparency is far from being the watchword of HS2. Can I just say to him that, having looked at the chairman's stock take, to find pages, Mr. Speaker, that have absolutely redacted right the way through means that transparency is not the order of the day. Can I just say that this opportunity to review entirely this project should be grasped with both hands by the Secretary of State, and he should actually review the nationwide transport and communication policy. And I urge him to take a deep breath and look at a comprehensive assessment across car, bus, train, air, and indeed the new technologies such as 5G and broadband, because I think it's essential that we look at the technological advances before we let this project go any further. Can I just say, Mr. Speaker, that as the carriages being built for Crossrail pile up in Worksop because we can't get that project right, let us just draw a deep breath, cancel this project, start again, and get a decent, comprehensive transport policy.
Secretary of State.
I know that Douglas Oakerby will have been listening to my Right Honourable friend's words with great interest, and will no doubt take into account the latest National Rail Travel Survey information. She will, of course, meet with him as well. And I'll just reflect on the final point, because the rest of it is, of course, Douglas Oakerby is looking at all this. The final point about all forms of travel and across the country. I entirely agree with my Right Honourable friend. I recently, having ordered it 2 years ago, got an electric car, and it arrived finally a couple of weeks ago. It is clear that transport is changing in this country. It is absolutely clear that we have to take a more holistic view of transport at all, of which rail is one part, and there's much else to consider.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too would like to welcome the Secretary of State to his new position, and he must be so thankful to have inherited another failing Grayling legacy. Mr. Speaker, we know the increased costs and delays have been covered up since 2016 and denied at the dispatch box. So while I welcome the review, should there not be an inquiry into this hiding of key information from the House? And while I welcome the review, it's a bit strange that we've got a document that sets out the terms of the review, and around a third of this document is redacted. So can the Secretary explain why that is? What changes are going to be made to the cost-benefit criteria going forward, and why? And while the Secretary said many of the benefits of the scheme were previously underestimated, I would remind him a lot the business case rested in the fact there's assumptions that any business people travelling the train were treated as downtime, so shorter journeys was treated as extra productive time. But clearly that's not the same now. We've got Wi-Fi on the go, so we confirm that the business case won't be over-egged in that aspect. Now, the current proposals also mean that journeys north of Crewe to Scotland will actually be slower than the existing Virgin service just now. So will the review look at that and look at perhaps a different type of rolling stock? But if it does, what does that mean for the existing rolling stock procurement, which is ongoing at the moment? What further reviews are going to be made to track design that could mean slower high-speed trains but reduce costs in terms of that cost-benefit analysis? And what is the contractual status of the recent contract awards to First Trenitalia, given that the government might now be doing a full stop decision? What would that mean for that contract? What's the spend to date, the committed spend going forward, and the Barnett allocations to Scotland? And what's going to happen going forward? We were promised at the dispatch box in day one of the high-speed trains operating, they would go all the way to Scotland, and that's now not the case. So can the Secretary answer these, and if not, put them in writing, please?
I think, I hope the honourable gentleman will forgive me if I write back to him on some of that rather than detain the House on all of it, but he is absolutely right, and I should have mentioned in response to my right honourable friend, I'm unhappy about having any of that Alan Cook report redacted. I've read the rest of it. It's not hugely exciting. I pushed back on that with the department, and it is just the lawyers saying this stuff is the commercially confidential stuff that I can't force to be released. But I totally agree with him. It'd be much better if you could read every single page. I mean, that is the law. On the downtime, but I don't disagree. It's just that, you know, lawyers will not allow that to happen. On the downtime when travelling, he's absolutely right. You know, lots of people work very productively when travelling. I know that's my favourite time to work uninterrupted. The benefits, I think, and that is something I can assure the honourable gentleman that Doug Oakerby will look at, the benefits to which Alan Cook was referring to were some of the build benefits where a line runs and you might therefore have new industry and so on and so forth around it, homes, etc. And the last point I'll comment on, and I'll write back to him on the rest, is implications on the West Coast Partnership, very important indeed. In their contract, I think in 2026, but it would be in line with if HS2 went ahead, they would become a shadow operator. So it's built into that particular contract if the thing goes ahead.
Order. There is a further urgent question after this, and there are then 3 ministerial statements before we get to backbench business. Therefore, there is a premium upon brevity from back and front benches alike. For the avoidance of doubt, what I'm looking for from colleagues is not dilation and not preamble, but single-sentence questions, which will be brilliantly exemplified, I feel sure, by the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Derbyshire Dale, Sir Patrick McLaughlin.
Thank you for that challenge, Mr. Speaker. Can I first welcome my Right Honourable friend to his position? Can I say to my Right Honourable friend that the easiest thing for the government to do is to cancel this project? That would be easy to do. I actually think it would be the wrong thing to do for this reason. I will find it ironical that as we leave the European Union, I can get a high-speed train to Paris or to Brussels, but not to Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield. And when my honourable friend talks about the overspend, we seem to be able to accommodate the overspend at the drop of a hat for Crossrail, which is overrunning and is a London project as is incredibly important for London, and not take a similar view to a project which has been long thought out and I believe absolutely essential for the major cities outside London in this country.
Well, I would say to my right honourable friend, I'm not short of advice on what to do on HS2, but few pieces of advice come from somebody as distinguished as a former Transport Secretary. I've heard what he's had to say. I know Doug Oakerby will have done, and I look forward to taking it into account.
Lillian Greenwood.
I welcome the Secretary of State to his place. He must understand the huge disappointment in the East Midlands that HS2 Phase 2B, which will transform connectivity, as the Honourable Gentleman has just said, Right Honourable Gentleman, apologies, between Birmingham and the economies of the Midlands, Yorkshire, the North East and Scotland. It's now facing a delay of up to 7 years or even cancellation. And that's particularly the case when the Chancellor yesterday failed to even mention the Midlands Rail Hub in his spending review, and when his predecessor not only repeatedly assured us that HS2 would happen, but also cancelled the electrification of the Midland Main Line. I know that the Oakerby review is due to report, but that disappointment will turn to deep anger if he doesn't ensure that the Midlands receives the investment in its transport that it needs.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have the question from the Transport Select Committee Chair. The one thing I can assure her is there's £48 billion of other unrelated rail investment over the next few years. So both the Midlands and the Northern Powerhouse Rail side of things will certainly have huge and massive investment.
Reiterating my plea for brevity, I hopefully call Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, welcome to the Secretary of State to his new position. Second thing is, I entirely endorse the views of the member for Aylesbury and the member for Amersham. The reality is that this whole project is completely out of control. The costs have gone up, as I've said repeatedly. I've voted against it. There is a petition in the House of Lords, which I believe my constituents are absolutely right to pursue. This whole project is a complete white elephant and should be cancelled.
As I say, I'm not short of advice on this, and Doug Oakerby will definitely have heard his words.
Mr. Barry Shearman.
I'll try to be brief. I've always been against this. I've been reviled by ministers when I've said it's going to end up at 100 billion. I wanted the investment in a network across the north of England in preference to this. But will you assure me we'll learn the lessons? This is a great sector. We do wonderful things. We built the Olympics on time and it was magnificent. We learn the lessons. I understand there are 12 gagging orders from senior former employees of HS2. Will they air their evidence? Can they give evidence to this inquiry? And can we make sure that we learn the lessons? This sector, we're good at it. Why has this gone wrong?
Well, I mean, even with the Olympics, the cost changed over a period of time. Is actually the truth, of course. But the honourable gentleman will know that big projects do require management, and this process is designed to make sure this is properly grasped. I agree with him. We need to deliver that transport infrastructure across the north. I'm surprised no honourable member has mentioned it yet, but these two questions are not entirely unrelated to each other, so we must get it right for the north, for all of our country.
Jeremy Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure it's the entirely appropriate expression to congratulate my right honourable friend for inheriting responsibility for HS2, but may I wholeheartedly congratulate him for becoming the Secretary of State. In agreeing entirely with what our right honourable friend for Aylesbury has put to him this morning, can I press the Secretary of State on the point he made about enabling works? As he knows, there is more than one kind of enabling work currently underway. Some of the enabling work is the destruction of ancient woodland sites. There are 7 of them in my constituency, along with a very old and much valued pear tree in the village of Cubbington. Surely it is possible and surely it is sensible, given that he's announced an all-options review, including the possibility that this project will be cancelled or significantly revised. Surely it's possible and sensible to categorise those types of enabling work that will do irreversible damage and postpone them until the review has concluded. He's already announced a substantial delay in this project. Surely a delay of a few weeks more would be sensible to make sure we don't do irreversible damage.
Mr. Speaker, as I said before, to have a proper go, no-go decision, we do need to continue to allow enabling works. However, I can actually ask my right honourable friend and the Transport Minister, who is handling these major projects, to meet and discuss this specific concern.
Dennis Skinner.
Unlike Derbyshire Dales, the HS2 goes through many villages in the Bolsover and North East Derbyshire area. The result is that there are a lot of people in those villages, more than 100 people affected by the HS2. I want to know as soon as possible just exactly what is going to happen to this £100 billion project, because it goes through Derbyshire on 2 separate lines. Not only does it go past Sheffield, it also stops at the Sheffield station. And so there is a slow track and a fast track in Derbyshire. The idea that the HS2 is based upon getting to London 30 minutes sooner is a joke. And for that reason, he should start over again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Look, I know that the honourable gentleman's constituency is affected in a big way, and I refer to what I said before. This project affects a lot of people's lives, the demolitions and the rest of it in his patch. He asked me to do this as soon as possible. I have got Douglas Oakervey on an unbelievable timetable, supported by a fantastic group of people, to get this done and reported back this autumn. He will not have to wait before the end of the year.
Maggie through.
Speaker, Long Eaton, Sandiacre and Stanton Gate are grossly affected by the eastern arm of HS2. And as the Chair of the Treasury Select Committee has already indicated, it brings its advantages as well. It brings jobs and growth as well as the pain. Two things. One is that any delay causes further stress and uncertainty, not just for residents, but for businesses as well. And they will be blighted forevermore, even if my honourable friend takes the easy way out and cancels the Eastern Arm. And my plea to the Secretary of State is do not cancel that Eastern Arm. I will not allow the East Midlands and Erewash to be the poor relations yet again.
Mr. Speaker, I think every exchange indicates the extent to which, whilst everyone is able to welcome a review, I suspect when we get to the announcement of that review on the other side, that the House won't be quite so united. But I absolutely hear my honourable friend's comments.
Liam Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Inflation aside, this multi-billion-pound increase in costs betrays nothing other than sheer incompetence in the management of this project. But in the West Midlands, 100,000 jobs are now in jeopardy. Hundreds of millions of pounds of new rates are now in jeopardy. The future prospects of the younger generation are now in jeopardy. So I want to know from the Secretary of State what compensation has been sought by the Mayor of the West Midlands, because my understanding is he's asked for precisely nothing.
Well, we have on the Doug Oakervey board a range of different people, including Andy Street. We are making sure that all the representations therefore go into it. And as I say, I don't want to kind of rush to prejudge this. We do know certain things. We know from the Alan Cook report this range of 72 to 78 billion. I don't have confidence in the data that I've been provided yet to know whether the benefits have outstripped or understripped these various different costs. And I just start with a blank sheet of paper, and I just want the data. Give me the facts, and then we'll be in a much better position to decide, including for people throughout the West Midlands.
Victoria Prentice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure I was as